Welcome to The Explainer. Let's dive right into what is, honestly, a fascinating geopolitical thriller today. We're looking at how Iran's 40-year geographic trump card, basically the ultimate leverage it held over the global economy, completely backfired in 2026. You see, for decades, Iran sat right at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, projecting this absolute conviction: if they close the strait, the world comes crawling. But according to our source material, when they finally played that card, they ended up handing their neighbors the exact political permission they needed to permanently destroy that very leverage. To really grasp the sheer magnitude of this event, we have to start with a massive number: 20 million. Before this crisis hit, every single day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil were squeezed through a waterway that's barely 39 kilometers wide. That represented about 20% of all global petroleum liquids consumption, right alongside 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. The entire world relied completely on this flow, until suddenly, well, they didn't.
Section 1. The ultimate geographic weapon. The stakes we are dealing with here are absolutely massive. Nearly 15 million barrels per day of crude oil and condensate moved through this single, narrow corridor. That is 34%, more than a third of all global crude oil trade relying on one tiny vulnerability. And what's truly fascinating is where all that oil was going. 84% of it was heading straight to Asian markets. China and India alone combined for 44% of all Hormuz crude oil flows, and places like Japan and South Korea were critically dependent on it as well.
As the Defense Horizon Journal put it, the world literally had no language for what happens when that flow stops. Why? Because Iran's power was always in the threat of closure, not the reality of it. The International Energy Agency, the global markets, nobody was truly prepared for the global energy switch to just be flipped off.
Moving to Section 2, closing the global choke point.
Well, the reality hit hard. Following U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran on February 28, 2026, the IRGC just immediately closed the strait. And this set off a wildly rapid, cascading escalation of events. Shipping firms suspended their operations almost instantly. War risk insurance? Effectively unavailable. The threat wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a very real, physical blockade reshaping the globe in real time.
So the crucial point here is the immediate aftermath, which was absolutely devastating. Maritime traffic collapsed by more than 90%. We are talking about ripping up to 20 million barrels of oil per day out of the global market in a flash. Unsurprisingly, oil prices surged right past $100 a barrel, and the whole world started desperately searching for an answer to one single question: is there any way to move this oil that doesn't go through the strait?
Which brings us to Section 3, the pipeline counter-move.
Turns out the answer to that question was yes. And here is where static infrastructure completely defeats a dynamic military threat. The only countries in the Gulf region with meaningful bypass pipelines are the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And, it's amazing how fast diplomatic stances shift when billions of dollars of oil are on the line. Both of them immediately flip from neutral parties to active adversaries by just throwing their valves wide open. The UAE's 80-COP pipeline to Fujairah completely bypasses the strait, and they maxed it out at 1.8 million barrels per day. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia activated its east-west petrol line, pumping an incredible 7 million barrels per day. Together, they bypassed the strait entirely, pumping a combined 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels a day to keep Asian buyers supplied. Now, it wasn't the full 20 million, but it was enough to prevent total catastrophe and prove that the world could actually function without Iranian permission.
Section 4, Iran's violent retaliation. So, realizing their strategic choke point was actively being circumvented, the scale of the Iranian retaliation was staggering. According to our sources, Iran directed 83% of its total strikes during the war at Gulf Cooperation Council countries. The UAE tracked 174 ballistic missiles and 689 drones. And think about what they targeted: the bypass infrastructure itself. Drones struck the Fujairah port pipeline terminus, they hit Dubai International Airport, they struck an ADNOC refinery facility that would normally produce over 900,000 barrels of oil a day. They even went after the pumping stations on the Saudi East-West pipeline, temporarily cutting throughput.
But here is the ultimate kind of bitter irony of this entire conflict. Iran actually needs the strait too. To bypass it, Iran inaugurated its own Gorajosk pipeline back in 2021, but had a tiny capacity of only 300,000 barrels per day and reportedly stopped loading cargoes way back in 2024. So actually, think about that. Iran closed a waterway it desperately needed because its own bypass was barely functional, all to punish neighbors who possessed working massive alternative routes. Analysts point to this as a truly historic strategic miscalculation.
Finally, Section 5, the permanent strategic shift.
In a move that would have been completely unthinkable just 12 months prior, the UAE's posture fundamentally changed. UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan explicitly labeled Iran an enemy, not a rival, an enemy. The UAE withdrew its diplomats, closed Iranian institutions inside its borders, and, according to Wall Street Journal reports, actually pushed the US to forcefully open the strait, even suggesting the US occupy Iranian-held islands. This was definitely no longer a neutral country threading a diplomatic needle. This insight from the Atlantic Council perfectly summarizes the fallout. The whole perception of Gulf Arab states as untouched, safe havens was completely shattered. The trust gap between the Gulf states and Iran was permanently destroyed. Every single Iranian missile that hit a UAE facility simply converted one more diplomatic stakeholder into an active opponent. The deterrence architecture Iran had spent 40 years building, the idea that closing the strait was too economically catastrophic to even consider, poof, it was gone the moment they actually did it.
So, to ensure the globe is never held hostage like this again, an international coalition is executing a clear, systematic plan. Step 1, maximize existing pipelines, which we already saw the UAE and Saudis do. Step 2, flush long-dormant infrastructure projects with emergency funding. And Step 3, permanently engineer Hormuz out of the equation. For example, there's now a proposed 116-kilometer UAE corridor concept, which is a cross-peninsula link connecting the Persian Gulf directly to the Gulf of Oman. Every new pipeline, every new bypass transforms Hormuz from a binary on-off switch for global energy into just one important route among several.
And so we are left with this fascinating reality and a massive question to ponder. Iran closed the strait to prove it was indispensable. But what they actually proved is that the world is incredibly motivated, fully capable, and now actively working to make Iran dispensable. In trying to weaponize geography, they catalyzed a unified global effort to make that geography permanently irrelevant. So what does the future hold for a country that built its entire strategic identity around controlling the choke point the world has now decided to bypass? It's a profound shift for sure. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the map.